All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of Scrubbing the Skies, the webinar series of the Institute for Carbon Removal Law and Policy. As always, I'm Will Burns, co-founder and co-executive director of the Institute. The Institute's mission is to contribute to the progressive development of the governance of the emerging suite of carbon dioxide removal options, foster notions of justice and equity in all phases of carbon removal, and contribute to the structuring of robust public engagement protocols. The Institute also seeks to educate the CDR community and broader public about important scientific and technological aspects of carbon removal. Well, last week was certainly a star turn for direct air capture in the United States, including the Department of Energy's announcement of the first round of direct air capture hub awards and Occidental's purchase of one of the largest DAC companies in the world, Carbon Engineering. However, as we know, there's plenty of DAC buzz in other parts of the world also, and that include Kenya's Rift Valley, where a startup company, Octavia Carbon, is seeking to deploy the first DAC plant in the global south. And I'm pleased to have two of the company's principals with me today to focus on the prospects for direct air capture in Kenya and more broadly in the global south. Martin Freimuller is the founder and CEO of Octavia, and Duncan Karaoke is the company's product lead. Welcome to both of you. We will begin with a brief presentation by Martin and Duncan, followed by a series of moderator questions, and then we'll turn it over to the audience for Q&A. So feel free throughout the presentation to begin populating the Q&A box. And with that, I will turn things over to Martin.
Thank you so much, Will, for welcoming us here today. We're definitely huge fans of the webinar series, so it's exciting times for us. It's even totally exciting. We might tease already because it's almost for us like a two-part series. We have the unique privilege of being on Scrubbing the Skies today and on This is CDR tomorrow. And because we don't just want to like repeat ourselves over and over and then bore our viewers, we thought we'd sort of like do a two-part almost, where we'll focus today a bit more on sort of the policy and economics of direct air capture in Kenya. And tomorrow we'll really dive a lot deeper into sort of our specific tech approach and the sort of energy equation to direct air capture in Kenya. But with that, thank you so much, and I'll hand over to Duncan for the intro.
All right, thank you all. We're really excited to share the work that we've been doing and that we are continuing to do. So at Octavia, we design and build direct air capture machines. And the process itself is quite simple. It basically plays around with the chemistry of CO2. And the process is a cyclic process that takes place in two stages, as you can see in this infographics here. There's a capture phase where CO2 is selectively absorbed from ambient air by a chemical contactor with a very large surface area. And once that chemical contactor is saturated, we seal the system tightly and we create a vacuum and heat it. And that kicks off the second stage, which is the release phase or the desorption stage. And from there, we can take that CO2 that has been released by the chemical filter, we can process it, and we can inject it into geological reservoirs to store it away durably. DAC itself, most people would agree, is a gold form of carbon dioxide removal, but it faces very hard constraints. And we'll touch on some of them here. One is around its high energy intensity. Because CO2 is very dilute in the air, it does have a minimum amount of work that it needs to separate from other gases. And so its energy intensity is high. There are also constraints around where you permanently store away the CO2 once it's been removed from the air. As a result of its nascency, it's also quite high in price, and especially in countries in the global north, there is low community acceptance for DAC today. We solve this by basically designing and building our technology and deploying it in Kenya. So to solve the question of energy intensity, we purposely designed our machines to rely on waste heat for up to 90% of its energy needs. And so our technology integrates quite neatly with geothermal, of which there is up to half of Kenya's renewable energy capacity, installed capacity today is from geothermal. And so that drives down the cost of operating our machines. There's also the geology to store the CO2 and a very competent storage partner at that. Within the Kenyan Rift, where we have a lot of the geothermal energy in Kenya, we do have geology that we can use to store, to lock away the CO2. And we have a storage partner that does in situ mineralization of CO2. The name is Cella Mineral Storage, and we are partnering with them to deploy our pilot plant on the site. There's also a vast supply of talent for very cost-effective manufacturing. DAC itself is one, it's a manufacturing play, and the second, it's an infrastructure play. And that just needs hands, it needs people, and needs people who would be deployed at this. And in Kenya, because we have a much lower cost of living than other places where DSC is being developed, we are able to deploy much higher capacity or more hands to the, or more brains to the problem. There are also tremendous co-benefits around deploying DAC in Kenya, particularly around increasing energy access for ordinary Kenyans like myself, and also around creating meaningful employment for young Kenyans. And so this has seen us gain a lot of community and policymaker buy-in as we've done our stakeholder engagement. So crucially, we built this, it's not only on paper. We built a total of 5 at-scale machines, but these are the different iterations that we've gone through. With each build that we've had, Thursday on the left is our first design, which we open sourced on the open air community to further the knowledge of DSC around the world. And our latest model, which we call Lenana, is a 10-ton a year model. And that's basically the design that we've settled on, and we are scaling up its manufacture. We have built a second of this and are gearing up to build a third of this model. With each unit, these machines have about 256 parts, or at least the last one has about 256 parts. And so there is a lot of optimization that goes into the tech around aspects like creating vacuums, having even distribution of heat, even airflow, etc. And just by virtue of being able to build this highly modular system, we're able to learn and mature our technology much faster. So the culmination of the work that we've been doing over the past year is in our pilot plant called Project Hummingbird, which we have partnered with Cella to basically build in the Kenyan Rift around the Naivasha area. It will capture about 1,000 tons of CO2. And as the name suggests, this Project Hummingbird is just the beginning. It's a drop in the big ocean, and we will look to scale this up much quicker after that. So at Octavia, we have a very strong team. We are 34 people. And right now, we estimate around the 5th largest DAC company. Of course, the number changes all the time, but something we're immensely proud of. And this is just a testament to the job creation potential of DSC in Kenya. Most of the people, about 90%, are younger than 30, and that means that we are able to create meaningful employment for young people in Kenya. And we cannot ignore the environmental justice aspects of deploying DAC in Kenya. So basically, Kenya and many other countries in sub-Saharan Africa have been greatly affected by climate change. And for what this has looked like for us has been basically crops running dry. My own parents didn't have water running in their taps at the beginning of this year because of the longest drought that we faced in the country. And that's what climate change looks like in Kenya. You can see the picture down on the bottom right. is a community that has basically been devastated, a pastoralist community called the Maasai community in Kenya that has been devastated by climate change. And that's what climate change does to the land, and it causes a lot of devastation in communities. But for us, being able to build and deploy this technology gives us a very strong sense of agency around fighting climate change. And our message is always very strong that we're not just victims of climate change, but we do have the solutions here. And it's a great privilege for us to be able to develop this technology and use it to basically help the world. And beyond that, DAC will be an engine for sustainable economic growth in Kenya, and we hope that it will open the door to other industries like green steel and production of fertilizers and other green industries that can drive Kenya into becoming a rich country.
Great. And I think just to stress, like, that community that you see in the bottom right here is one of the local communities that actually stands to benefit from the project that we are now building. But we have already done some community engagement and really seen how there's both a lot of, like, anger in some ways at the effects of, climate change that these guys didn't contribute to. None of those folks has a car, none of them ever bought a liter of petrol in their life, but yet they're experiencing this very badly, like the herds being devastated. But crucially, there's also the sense of hope that direct air capture, as one of many industries, can really, like, bring employment and young people back into this community and actually, like, really create a sustainable living, and in a much longer term actually preserve a way of life that these people used to have for centuries until essentially climate change that they did not, of course, took it away from them. But beyond that, it's really important to say that, this is sort of going to talk a bit more about the policy angle of this, because of course we are here talking about carbon law and policy, as the name suggests. DAC in Kenya, and this is really important, can absolutely and will compete on speed and on costs. That is the angle that we really can bring to this industry. And we think that it matters a lot. The one thing, and I'll talk to that briefly, is that we cannot necessarily compete on its subsidies. And that is a difficult dynamic for us, because while we welcome the fact that there's generous policy incentives for direct air capture around the world, it is also difficult for us to sort of think about how that can sort of, like, go hand in hand with really speeding DAC down the cost curve in the most cost-effective places on Earth for doing it, of which Kenya might well be one. But just to talk briefly about, like, what emerging policy on DAC looks like in Kenya today, there is a lot of understanding from the Kenyan government side what DAC can do for the country. The president of Kenya is very excited about DAC. He was in fact pitched by DAC companies and representatives and stakeholders at the US Africa Leadership Summit last year, and really, like, saw the potential for this. And from the president to his advisors to the local ministers, there is a commitment to building out direct air capture quickly with fit for purpose and safe regulatory frameworks that are sort of developed hand in hand with industry, and can use pilots like the one that we are building to really, like, build out a framework for a much larger industry, and essentially set the bedrock for using direct air capture as a sort of key technology to unlocking other industries, like Duncan has said, like that can also use air captured carbon to essentially replace fossil carbon in the global economy, where we frankly know it has to go. And this is a way that this can actually happen. Kenya can be a place to make it happen. But just to sort of, like, run, like, the speed is there, the commitment to speed is there. We know that permitting is a big question. It can take years out of a project, which is really important. Kenya is aware that it can compete on that dimension. What beyond that Kenya has is, abundant renewable energy. It's the 6th largest geothermal producer in the world. It has abundant waste heat and a bunch of renewables on top of that, 93% renewable grid. And all of that is also co-located with very prime CO2 storage, eliminating the potential costs and carbon footprint of transporting CO2, which is really significant in many places, especially when you look for waste heat that many areas have, but not always in the same places where you have for storage. We have very high carbon removal efficiency. Geothermal in Kenya is one of the cleanest in the world, 17 grams of CO2 emissions per kilowatt hour. We have very moderate climate at sort of a high altitude, but very low seasonality right on the equator. And then we have a really cost-effective talent. Combine all these, and as we've heard, Kenya is absolutely a place that will have a crucial role in bringing this key technology down the cost curve, much as climate science calls for. But of course, we have to also contrast that to what DAC policy looks like elsewhere. And we really have to think about, how does that not compete, but how does that complement each other, right? But at a sort of high level, the difficulty there is that when we look to DAC policy in other countries, say the US, again, and it's just to be clear, like, we welcome this, but the tricky thing there is that essentially, like, a government will pay for you to build DAC, it will pay for you to run the DAC machine, and then finally it will also buy the credits from you. And that is a very difficult dynamic for us in the global south to think about, because of course, how could we ask Kenya to compete with that? Kenya does not have billions of dollars lying around that it could spend on something like this. And while it might be a lot cheaper regardless, the question is, like, when you look at the costs after subsidies, that might be a very tricky thing, basically, because of course Kenya would be looking to direct air capture, something that can contribute to the treasury. Well, the same industry would be treated quite differently in other jurisdictions. But of course, what matters is the unsubsidized cost of DAC, because nobody is under the illusion that we will be able to subsidize direct air capture at the levels that we're doing at the moment once we get to gigaton scale. And I think in that sense, we really have to build the industry of today with that gigaton scale in mind, because otherwise we might as well not spend the premium on technology like direct air capture. And I think in that sense, Kenya does have one very attractive thing for private buyers of carbon removal. And that is that DAC in Kenya has more financial additionality than it would have elsewhere, basically. If you think about how far your dollar will go in bringing DAC down the cost curve, there's a strong argument to be made that it will go further in Kenya, which is otherwise quite starved of the funding to actually scale this crucial industry, even though we have just the right resources to do that. And I think it's just really something that we think is like really key. That in many ways, funding is a big question for this in Kenya. Like, fundraising is hard for deep tech in the global south, and crucially, like, purchases from customers can become one of the crucial ways of financing this build out and catalyzing progress in these early stages, which is why we think this is so important to say. Basically, it's really important that we spend the right policy subsidies in the right places. But then in that sense, like, as more public funding crowds in, there's a really important role for private funding to think about where it is most catalytic. And arguably that can be in places like the global south, where you actually have that bang for your buck, if you like, in speeding this down the cost curve. And I think just to talk about one point here in particular, which I think is really important, which is that, we say that Kenya has a point that also just like it scratches the surface of what's going on here. Because the point here is not so much that talent in Kenya is cost effective, but that it is available. And I think in that sense, it is really important to sort of stress one point. And I think it's not often mentioned in polite society, because the tricky thing is that this point is often sort of like weaponized by people with, different agendas that we might not associate with, nativists and ageist and sexist and so on. But the truth is that the dependency ratio, the ratio of working age adults as compared to, children and the elderly, is decreasing rapidly across the global north. So, like, we are going from a dependency ratio of 3-to-1 in the global north to a dependency ratio of 2-to-1, which frankly means that I've tried to sort of like get this in my icons there, is that there's a lot fewer people with hard hats in the first place, right? And that is really tricky, because as we are going through that demographic transition, we want to go through a climate tech transition. And that is such a really tough point to think about, because when we look at an industry like DAC, and we've known this since 2020 when the Rhodium Group did some really solid modeling around this, if we want to build a DAC industry in, say, the US, but this is true across the global north, at gigaton scale, that will frankly need as much as a third of the construction workforce in relevant sectors here in the US, for example, right? And the point is that that is the 2018 workforce. Again, that is not going to be a workforce of 2050. which is like a real challenge that we have to think through. Like, how do we allocate that labor that we have to the climate transition without risking like to increase the cost of this massively? And in that sense, we are seeing that, like the US Bureau of Labor Statistics is stressing this over and over. The workforce for the clean transition is short. And one thing that we would just like to stress in that is Kenya can be a partner here to the US and other countries in the global north, which is really important because carbon removal is one of few industries that is not location specific. It's something that I think all of us have said at one point or another, you can do carbon removal everywhere. And it is true. But what it also means that if we have to look at a limited labor pool and we have to allocate it towards different sectors, frankly, there is enough jobs already for electricians, say, to just electrify every single household in the US, which frankly has to happen within the next 27 years. That is a short time frame for ripping out centuries worth of fossil fuel infrastructure from 100 million US homes or something along those lines. And then there's other things like EV charging infrastructure, heavy industry, renewables installation, and so on, all of which are location specific. The one thing that isn't is carbon removal. So we would stress that it should fall into a bucket more like critical minerals mining, where we say, okay, of course, we might not want this to be in, like hostile countries, like, maybe Russia or like China or other things, other countries where you might have some questions around collaborating in future. But Kenya is, of course, very aligned with the US on so many things. It's a dependable democracy. And crucially, like by deploying there, you don't risk creating demand for DAC that can outcompete this clean tech workforce for other sectors. It is something that we really think a lot about, where we think that in that sense, Kenya can benefit from partnership from the US and elsewhere. And crucially, that does not mean that there's no role for DAC or CDR in the US and in the global north. But it does mean that you might want to think about where is your strong suit? What is the gains from trade, as we used to like to say, where we can think about what is the comparative advantage. And in a country like the US, that might be in manufacturing really high-end air contactors and researching those and developing those. And we already see that there's a tremendous amount of really great work being done on this, on the US research campuses and across the US and across the global north more broadly. But when it comes to building out the manufacturing and the infrastructure, we know from past waves of climate tech that if we want to get this down and prosper, we need to go south. And Kenya is just the right candidate in really making that happen at the scale and speed at which we want to make it happen at the rate it has to. That's a sort of quick presentation. There will be more, as I said, tomorrow at this is CDR, but for now, thank you to our partners. There's a bunch of them there. Very proud to work with all of these folks. But we'll stop it there for now because we really want to make sure we have plenty of space for Q&A as well. So back over to you, Will. Thank you so much for the stage.
All right. Thank you so much for the overview, Martin and Duncan. So yeah, let me just kick it off with a couple of questions, and then we'll move to some audience questions. One thing I'm curious about, a lot of the newer facilities that we're talking about in the United States, the contemplated DAC facilities are pretty large compared to what we've seen to date, right? Orca is about 4,000 tons a year. We're looking at facilities in Wyoming and Texas, right? That could be over 1 million, right? And you contemplate much smaller modular sort of systems, right? I think your site talks about these 10-ton facilities, and then maybe ultimately scaling up to like 100, right? What does the business model look like for that? How many of those do you have to sell to be able to make this viable? And do you think that that's possible?
Yes, I can start by talking about why we chose to go that highly modular. And the reason for such a highly modular technologies, in the journey of tech development, it's a lot easier to iterate when a unit costs you $30,000 than if it costs you $300,000. And it's a lot easier to build for us. And as I mentioned, there's so many subsystems and so many engineering aspects to optimize for. So building highly modular was for us to mature all these different aspects. of the technology so that we can essentially mature the entire machine. And so our 10 ton a year model is the one that we'll use. We'll then scale that up in a Gen 2 model that will capture per unit. Each unit measures about 2 meters by 2 meters. That's the physical footprint. For our Gen 2 model, it will be about 100 tons a year. And essentially what we're doing is replicating what Cella did. And that's how we see that we can drive the cost down much more cost effectively, basically by leveraging some technological advancements within the unit and also large scale manufacture. And Martin can talk a bit more about the commercial side.
Yeah, because there's another really important, and that's a great question, Will. And I think another thing I wanted just to say is, like, another reason to build modular is technology risk, right? Because if you build that 1 million ton facility, and as always happens with these things, there's a 50% cost overrun, and like it takes 2 years longer than you planned. How are you going to find it second, right? That's the really key question here, right? Because the point is that you want to make this bankable, right? That is the only way that we can actually scale an industry. And frankly, if you want project finance to crowd into this space and to actually like see this as a safe asset to invest in, which it should be, right? Because this can be a highly centralized play around where you just bring in modules into like a site that has a storage facility, and you can actually just like hook up one machine after the other, after the other, after the other. And it is a very low risk thing inherently. But for you to demonstrate that, you actually have to build a bunch of them first, which is another key advantage to the modular approach as we see it. Because essentially like the pitch is a lot easier, but can tell you like, this machine costs X thousands of dollars. And we've built 100 of those. They work. They do what we said they do. And now we want to build another 50 or something like that, right? It's an easier sales pitch in many ways, which is partly why we really think that a modular approach is both beneficial on the technology front, but also sort of on the commercialization front, which I think is really important. And yeah, the other thing that I think you alluded to it is like it's also like then more possible to just pack up that thing and ship it elsewhere. And it is a really key aspect of how we see the scaling initially is that we might also ship some of these machines into other places where we have more generous policy subsidies. That is part of how we scaled it up and part of how we become a partner of really scaling DAC globally, right? And we already have some very strong partners there. Shout out to Retract, who we're talking to a lot, who is really interested in really thinking about this, not so much in one monolith DAC company and another monolith DAC company, all perfectly vertically integrated, doing everything basically. But how can we partner? How can we, some people specialize in like maybe building machine, and maybe in Kenya we will actually deploy these two, but then elsewhere we might be partnering with others to actually like deploy them in in jurisdictions elsewhere, so we can both benefit from the global supply chain, which is really key for getting the cost of it down, but also crucially really help push the global agenda and the global policy around this, that we can actually scale DAC at the rate that is demanded from us very much. So yeah, I think in that sense, like the modular approach helps you that you can essentially put those things in a shipping container and then put them elsewhere. It's so harder to do with a 1 million ton facility.
Okay. You mentioned cost a little bit on that. Let me tease that out. What's your current projected cost for first of a kind and then nth of a kind down the road?
Yeah, so great question. For the first of a kind, so like we have pretty good visibility on that on the module side, which is about 6% of the cost or so, because that's again the whole point of building modular. The plant side of that is a bit harder to say, but we do expect costs that are well below $500 per ton of CO2. So again, just hammering home the point, DAC in Kenya is very cost effective. Crucially, and there's a massive asterisk there, which is we haven't built it, so we have to build it. And of course, these things often end up being more expensive than we thought they would be. But as we scale this, we see rapid cost savings that are possible, frankly, from just doing this in Kenya. And there's a lot of derived advantages here, like very good carbon removal efficiency, as we said, very low cost and a lot of waste energy to tap into, and then also like very sort of like competitive workforce, both on cost but also on like just the ingenuity of actually driving innovation in this space, really like moving this technology forward. So that's where we are today. I think at nth of a kind, and I will say something slightly controversial here, but I do not think that DAC has a price floor. I think there's the inherent assumption that DAC will always be expensive, but it's really crucial to like actually dive into like what drives the cost of direct air capture. You know, I mean, we talked about there's a certain thermodynamic penalty that you have to accept here. With it just takes certain energy, but energy can come in the form of heat, and heat in Kenya is ultra abundant. It literally comes from the ground. And once you start rethinking about that way, essentially you see that DAC on the OPEX side has two cost drivers. One is regenerating your CO2 filter, like, you know, whatever that looks like, you know, whether it's heat or whether it's pressure or whether it's so humidity and so on. There's a bunch of ways of regenerating a filter, but that's one cost driver. And then the second cost driver is generally running a fan, because, you know, that tends to drive up the capex utilization of the machine. But there's a scenario like it's just, let's just do this as a thought experiment. We can put a machine into northern Kenya along the Rift Valley, where we have abundant geothermal heat and some of the highest wind speeds on Earth, like actually enough to put the North Sea to shame. So crucially, you could take the heat to regenerate your solvent, and you could take the wind to saturate the filter in the first place. And using a hydraulic system, you could essentially get rid of all that OPEX, and you could scale that in that part of the world to gigaton scale as well. And then for the rest of it, you know, there's capex, of course, and that capex today is expensive. But if you really dive in to ask what it is, essentially it is just steel and a bunch of organic chemistry. It's no rare earths there. There's no no great amount of critical minerals and so on. So crucially, this can be really cheap, and we want to get it to that point. But it can only be that cheap in places that have the right resources, which is why we say that DAC, for all that it can be deployed everywhere on Earth, is ultimately a location-specific industry, especially when you look at places where you can both capture CO2 cheaply and also store it cheaply. And the Rift Valley has both of these ingredients. So what is the floor for like DAC in our approach? You know, I'm not saying, by the way, that we will pursue a passive approach, essentially like using wind to saturate a filter. For the time being, those fans really pay for their way in capex utilization, as I said. But in the long run, it is entirely possible to think that a DAC credit can cost $20, $30, $40 per ton of CO2. That is controversial, and of course, the burden is very much on us to prove that is the case. But I think it is really important to sort of shift the narrative here of, you know, thinking that DAC, yes, DAC will always be energy intensive. We are not denying that. But the point is, there is places on Earth that are ultra abundant in energy. And crucially, when you go to those places, you can drive cost of DAC down very, very, very low. So I hope that sort of answers your questions, Will.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Well, I hope you can get there, right? Because you've got some of the larger companies talking about even in 2035, right, still being at, you know, 300, 400 a ton, right, which will make things a lot more problematic in terms of market penetration. So good on you. So let me talk about this energy question, right? Because this is an intriguing one and a challenging one in general for DAC, right? We know that a lot of the objections to large scaling of DAC is associated with energy, right? And the idea that if you're obviously running these facilities with fossil fuels, you defeat the purpose. And if you're running it with renewables, you're potentially diverting renewables from doing things like electrifying everything, and that may not be the optimal use, right? You have a way of getting around that, obviously, with geothermal, and you're starting off, as I understand, using waste heat, right? As you scale up, does that remain a clear benefit? Is there a point where you start having to avail yourself of geothermal that potentially could be utilized by Kenya or others for other purposes that might be more optimal?
It's a great question, and I'll start out on that initially. I think so for now we have waste heat, right? And I think one thing that we can already stress is that waste heat is available up to sort of megaton scale, which frankly today nobody knows what that looks like at megaton scale. We are so many orders of magnitude away from that. So at that point, things will start to be. But part of the reason we take deliberately chose like family of that air contact solvent, basically drive down the cost of that regeneration, basically. And the point there is that if you can regenerate your filter at 60 degrees Celsius, which is what we're aiming for, currently it's more than sort of 60 to 70 degrees range, then you don't have to compete with power production, right? Because for power production, you would look to much higher grade heat. And the crucial point about using low grade heat is not just that it's much more abundantly available, it is definitely, but it's also not competing with electricity production, which we see, as you say, as really crucial. We don't want to compete with this, but crucially, we all like look at having hundreds of gigawatts of that available across the East African Rift Valley, and there's about 4,000 miles of it. And that itself is enough to really take us to gigaton scale. You know, at some point, there will eventually come a point at, you know, when you're talking about like, you know, hundreds of millions of tons that you're capturing from the air, which also is a bit hard to imagine today. And who knows what that technology will look like at that point, where at least the way we currently see it, we might have to increasingly turn to, say, something like solar, which also has like, you know, some of the best solar irradiation in Kenya with no seasonality. So into the 2030s, probably the second half of 2030s, we might supplement the electricity that we need, if we do at that point, with solar and maybe some wind again. We have fantastic resources for that in Kenya and also along the East African Rift Valley. Again, there's a lot to like about building this in a place where you have renewables that are fantastic across the stack, really, right? Like solar with no seasonality. You have wind with the highest wind speeds. You have about 6 gigawatts of hydro potential, which very little has actually been built out. And then on top of that, you have something like 20 gigawatts of geothermal electricity potential across the East African Rift Valley, only a tiny fraction of which has actually been tapped. It's something like 900 megawatts. So there's really like a lot of that is to be liked. And crucially, what problem there is in Kenya at the moment, and just to like talk about what this looks like right now and what this is going to look like in future, the thing that is missing in Kenya today is not a supply of renewable energy, which is the case almost literally everywhere else. It is a demand for renewable electricity. Kenya has quadrupled its geothermal capacity in the past decade to up to like close to 900 megawatts of installed capacity, making it a crucial player in this industry. But the demand did not come at the same rate. And now there's a situation where the Kenyan Electricity Generation Authority goes out and asks for Bitcoin miners to set up in Kenya, where really we could actually use electricity like that for much more productive, well, not a discussion I will wade into, but for a very productive use in direct air capture, where it can then actually, like in a scenario where, say, we have a DAC project with already like offsets lined up against that by highly bankable Western buyers, that itself makes the geothermal project much more bankable too, because that is the real hurdle that Kenya has right now. Kenya wants to get to 100% renewable energy by 2030, but it is missing the demand. It's not missing the supply of renewable potential, it is missing the demand. And if we can develop that hand in hand, we can help Kenya drive towards that objective of 100% renewables, at which point it can also become a hub for, green industrialization across the board, like whether we're talking green hydrogen or green hydrocarbons, if you combine the thing we do with that, or green steel, green cement, you name it, it is really like very promising for us to see what can be done with that once we can unlock it with direct air capture as a catalyst. That's the vision.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Thinking of CDR as a demand pull incentive for renewables, right? Not true everywhere, but perhaps in Kenya. So, with that, let me move on to some questions from our audience. First question: I'm wondering who gets credit for the removed CO2? Would they be used for companies or countries in the global north to help them claim carbon neutrality, or does Kenya plan to use these credits to achieve its own NDC goals?
That's a great question. And in fact, one we're actually in active discussions with is like a government partner we're currently talking to in the global north, interested in buying from us. And by the way, I'm talking a bit more to the policy side of things, because Duncan really builds the machines. He's the brain behind that side. So Kenya has more than enough capacity for direct air capture to supply any need that it would have. So our vision for direct air capture in Kenya is that it becomes an export product, where essentially right now, today, there's a crucial role for private actors and governments and other players in the global north to buy this direct air capture down the cost curve, so it is available for a country like Kenya to meet its own NDC goal, 2, 3, 4 decades down the line, basically, right? But right now, we really need partners to buy this down the cost curve. We think it's more than justified, especially at this early stage, where, frankly, for DAC, the cost is higher today than it will be a few decades from now. And so it's really important to have partners to actually partner with us now, so Kenya doesn't have to buy that, $500-$600 per ton of CO2, and can actually do it so at significantly lower prices. But beyond that, again, I think there's this notion as well that direct air capture or CDR capacity, even more broadly, is limited, which is also something that we starkly disagree with, both from having run the maths and looking at the thermodynamics of this in Kenya, and seeing that there's vastly more available here that we can use even with the perspective we have today, right? And the crucial point here is that this is also going to change, right? There was a time when people said that solar will only ever be economic for oil rigs or other places where it's harder to get energy to. Frankly, today, the world looks very different, and we 100% expect the world to look very different in a few decades' time. Doesn't mean that you don't have to research on what the role of CDR is, and think about capacity constraints and so on. But for direct air capture, there's many gigatons per year of annual capacity available here that Kenya can use as an export product to grow its economy massively, and it can crucially ride to become a high-income country. That is the vision that we have for that in Kenya. So that will go to its ledger of other countries. Kenya might, at a later point, when its own NDC for carbon neutrality comes to, also use that for itself, but that would be additional capacity that we would sell to a country like Kenya separately, or whatever that regulation will look like at the time. But crucially, right now, for the foreseeable future, we want to develop this as an export product, which is also very much how the Kenyan government sees it.
Okay. All right, next question. Probably one more applicable for your partner, Cella, but you probably have some thoughts here. It says CO2 storage in basalt at commercial scales has been proven in Iceland, but all basalts are not equal. Has mineralization storage in Kenyan basalt been demonstrated?
No, but then to be fair, there's 2 or maybe 3 pilots for mineralization on Earth, right? So as an industry, it is just early stage. It has been studied, and there is published literature on this that dates back to 2021, and we'll sort of look to share so that it's in the notes for this as well later. But it has not been done, right? But again, crucially, that is true for CO2 mineralization almost everywhere, right, other than Iceland. And we think that we can sort of build it in a way that is safe and scalable in Kenya too. But again, really important point here. The questions on storage are much better addressed to Cella, not us as the capture partner.
Okay. All right. What is the source of this waste heat in Kenya? Waste from what? What is Kenya's primary method of generating electricity today?
So in geothermal systems, most of Kenya's systems are flash geothermal systems. So the process looks like is geothermal steam will come out from the ground with brine. The brine and steam are separated. The steam goes into electricity generation. And then at that point, it goes into condensation pools. So in some sites in Kenya, the geothermal brine is reinjected. In other sites, it's left in brine pools as well. But basically, the exhaust steam from the geothermal process is one source of waste heat. Basically, the steam after it's generated electricity. And the other one is the geothermal brine, which is reinjected into the ground. And because we regenerate at very low temperatures, both as viable sources of waste heat and are produced in quite abundantly during the electricity generation process. And eventually we look to design the geothermal power plants with that in mind as we scale up especially. And we're already talking to some of the developers or the EPCs for Kenya's geothermal systems and thinking about how this integrates at megaton scale.
And then I think just to maybe add a slight nuance in this for the longer term view, I mean, and I think there was a question about where, like, what is like Kenya's electricity mix today? That geothermal is about 45% of the grid today. It's about 900 megawatts. As I said, the goal that Kenya has is to make that 3 gigawatts by 2030 thereabouts. There's really like an ambition to scale it up quite massively. And then, of course, we'll also scale the availability of waste heat proportionally. But I think much as we talk about waste heat today, and again, that can take us pretty far, megaton scale is no joke. But the point is that we prefer talking about low-grade heat because that really constrains you much less because low-grade heat is available in many, many places on Earth. Geothermals probably being one of the best examples of the lowest carbon footprint and like cheapest heat that you will find anywhere on Earth, basically. And there, if you can tap really low grade reservoirs, I mean, is it waste? I mean, it wouldn't be used otherwise, or at least it currently wouldn't have any other economic use. But then, crucially, if you can create it that way, then it becomes a useful product, right? It is no longer waste. So like waste that exists today is really interesting for us, but in the longer term, we really think about this as low-grade heat, which is what we design our technology around.
Okay. Could you share how Octavia is thinking about carbon removal credits and what type of offtake customers you're targeting?
Again, I do more of the commercialization side, so I'll answer that quickly. So we are looking for partners across the board. Again, like I think in many ways, especially in Kenya, like our best investors are our customers. And so we see that different customers have different constraints. The ideal for us, of course, is like pre-purchases because they become a form of financing that we can use to actually build this plant, which is really important in a region that tends to have slightly higher costs of financing, like Kenya is. But there's also like a big role of offtake agreements just to sort of demonstrate future demands for credits. So we're in discussions with a range of clients already, like folks like Ghana and Milky Wire who bought from us, who want to partner with us to sort of bring that along, but also others that are really interested in sort of offtake agreement structures that essentially say that they will pay for credits as we develop them. And then there's some sort of hybrid structures as well, basically, where there's some payment schedule, basically, as you sort of hit certain milestones, which you're also talking about. And then beyond that, I mean, that's the sort of partnerships that we're probably looking for today. Those credits are certified by Puro, which is a really amazing partner to us. And so, yeah, we're looking to bring some very high quality credits to the market very soon. First ever ICRA certified DAC credits, we might also say. So crucial step in really aligning DAC with mainstream quality standards as well.
Mm-hmm. Hey, how close are you with Pure to being able to get certification, or how long do you think it'll take ultimately once you've developed the prototypes?
It's a great question, and Pure has been super amazing and quick in working with us. So we are already listed with them. So people can buy our pre-corps or like pre-carbon removal credits on Pure today. And as a next step with them, we might sort of look into a pre-validation type thing that Pure offers to really lower the cost for prospective buyers even further. The actual validation will be an on-the-ground one with a validator, and that will probably happen in Q2 of next year, which is when we have the actual site built as planned. And at that point, we'll actually get certified for the removal capacity that we are advertising as well.
Okay. Another cost question, as you can imagine. It says Octavia's website mentions there's a reliable trajectory to bring costs below 100 a ton. Can you discuss what that trajectory looks like?
So yes, we can. The way we think about scaling up and bringing down the costs, basically in three facets. So the first one is around technological advancements. And for these ones, we are basically talking about increasing the per unit capture capacity and essentially pulling all the capex of each unit, each modular DAC unit. So our Gen 2 model is is going to capture around about 100 tons of CO2 per year. That would halve the cost of capture for CO2 within each model. And won't stop at 100 tons. We'll push the envelope as far as it goes. The other one is around the economies of scale, especially around manufacture. So basically streamlining our supply chain. We've already developed a strong supply chain that we purposely focused it around the global south countries like India and China to multiply our cost advantage. And essentially, as we scale up and as we buy things in bulk, we do see that our costs come down quite significantly. And essentially, we're basing this on the Solar playbook, how large-scale manufacturing brought down the costs. And the last one is also around the energy that we use. So the cost of renewable energy are going to fall down, especially as we start integrating even other sources like solar, which are projected to falling to something in the region of 3 to 5 cents per kilowatt hour. As the cost of energy fall down, our OPEX follows quite closely. And basically, as we scale up and integrate all these forms of energy, we will see our costs falling down. We modeled this to around $250 a ton, but as we get to megaton scale, we do see that we can get this down to around $100 a ton captured and stored.
Okay. Yep. Interesting question here on benefit sharing with the government, right? And one thing to inject at the outset, maybe you could discuss a bit, is it's my understanding now that Zimbabwe, for example, is going to ask for about 30% of the revenue from projects, and there's some other countries on the continent that are also talking about hefty benefit sharing requirements for CDR companies. What do things look like in Kenya in that context? And if you have a crystal ball, where do you think the government is heading as you potentially scale this up?
Yeah, great question. And I think upfront, I will say that there is discussions like this happening in Kenya too, and I'll talk a bit more about it. One thing I will say very quickly is that Zimbabwe is about as far away from Kenya as Ukraine is from the UK. So and they have a very, very different history of developing over the past few decades as well. Kenya, crucially, has always really been very private sector led in its development, and there's sort of very little willingness by the government to jeopardize the strong private sector has around carbon markets, with Kenya being the largest producer of carbon credits on the African continent. But there is, of course, a question, and I think this very much stems from a range of nature-based projects where there is perceived to be quite egregious examples of communities not seeing the benefits of the work that they actually do, right? And if crucially we agree that if communities do the work, they should also see a significant share of the upside of that work, right? And of course, in practice, we see that it is more complicated because, of course, the paperwork and the consulting and so on of actually getting to carbon revenue with the conventional carbon market makes this all very complicated. But we do see that maybe there is a role for a compulsory type of benefits sharing there. For direct air capture, we would say that machines actually do the work of capturing and storing the CO2, right? It is a different type of carbon removal activity that we would argue deserve to be regulated differently, right? Crucially, I think the thing that resonates a lot with the Kenyan government is that the machines that we are building are designed and built and deployed in Kenya, with the vast bulk of the value addition actually happening in Kenya, which is, of course, a crucial concern that the government has here around foreign project developers coming in and taking the vast lion's share of the actual project revenue into foreign jurisdictions. So with us, there's thinking that this could be different. I think we are in discussions with the government on what that would look like. For full transparency, Kenya is discussing a certain benefit sharing ratio too, though that has been delayed partly because of strong pushback from the private sector. And whatever the final product will be, there's a lot of assurance from the Kenyan government that the last thing they want is to escape private investment. So any benefit sharing will be set at a level where it can both maximize the benefits for communities, but also like the private sector investment and the growth over time. So it will likely be a lot more moderate than in other countries where this has been floated. And direct air capture specifically might be regulated quite differently as well, for being a quite different type of activity too.
And just to add on that, it's also worth stressing that we are prioritizing benefits to local communities with this project. It's not to say that that is not something that because machines are doing the work, the local communities will not see that benefit. And so in our community engagement, one of the questions we basically ask is, what does the community need? And we've seen this model applied with other projects, and there's a lot around capacity building within the communities, and that's something that they care about, and that's something we'll be looking alongside our storage partners to really develop in projects that will build capacity in the local community.
Let me ask you a follow-up question on that in terms of the role of the community. One of the things I think you highlighted at the outset when you were contrasting the potential benefits of DAC deployment in Kenya as opposed to in the north was the specter of public opposition in the north to these kind of facilities. And we don't totally know yet, right? But there's certainly a lot of discussion. What does your public engagement procedures look like in Kenya? And do you see differences in terms of how communities in Kenya regard these kind of facilities as opposed to what we might see in the global north?
Yeah. So how we attack or go for community engagement, basically, for the initial community engagement, we did it with Cella. They're the ones who led it. And for the subsequent ones that we are doing, we are actually looking to get somebody from that community who would be basically the point of contact. And it would be somebody, an employee of Octavia, who would essentially carry our message and address any concerns that the community might have, and also take in what sort of community benefits they would like to see from this project. So that's how, and community engagement is a continuous process. So we are starting it right before we even stick a shovel in the ground. And we look to do that all the way until deployment and have the community really involved throughout the entire process. And basically, one of the things we really want the community to understand that is it's also that this project is also for them. It's not just for our clients or for the country. It's also for the local community. And beyond that, we will also look to make sure that we maximize the benefit. And we might even look to some form of revenue share. From the project.
Apologies, I think we are back. Sorry about that. I just with the hotspot and just going to call through. Just to answer the second half of the question really quickly, how is this different from the global north? We do think that, one unknown, frankly, but one thing that I think does worry us to some extent is that I think in parts of the global north, where direct air capture is very closely linked to the fossil fuel industry, that risks becoming a barrier, or at least it risks becoming politicized in, the fight between, the American left and right, between the role of the fossil fuel industry and climate transition and so on. And I think that is something where a lot of question around community acceptance come from. And crucially, in geothermal areas like, Iceland, for example, but also in Kenya, we have the right expertise to do that without the fossil fuel industry, which is also for now our plan. And we do think that can also drive a level of sort of deeper community trust, not relying on an industry that has at best a sort of like patchy track record with the impact that it had on local communities, and also where like there is a bit of a risk that if the parent company isn't really like aligned to like strict climate goals, and very few oil and gas companies are, there is some credibility with the projects that are actually happening on the ground around does that actually meet the 1.5-degree target if the activities of the parent company might not be aligned.
Okay. All right, we have reached the bewitching hour, and I'd like to thank both Martin and Duncan for a fascinating discussion. I'm sure we'll have you back at some point for some lessons learned. But we wish you the best of luck on this project, and I'd like to thank our audience for joining us. We'll be back in a couple of weeks. Wait for our announcements in terms of our next topic. Enjoy the rest of the summer, and we'll see everyone soon. Thank you, everyone. Goodbye now.